The town of Dover, of course, is the place that everyone always talks about when they're mentioning Brexit. What's your sense in Dover and in Kent in general about how people are feeling at the moment?
Well, I can see Paul doesn't live in Kent, because people in Kent, although the majority voted for Brexit, are terrified of the idea of lorries stacking up, pollution particles going into the lungs of our children. We're going to be at the blunt end of a bad deal or a no deal. Though I'm very hopeful that the government will come round to a deal. I think the election, or President-elect Biden assuming office, makes that more likely.
It's the EU coming around to a deal.
Well, yes and no. The government obviously is still hoping to break international law. The Lords turned out the legislation back to the Commons, and we're back in the same position where, to solve the problem with Northern Ireland, the Commons, well, the Conservative MPs may well vote again to break international law.
No, we're not voting to break international law. What we're saying is that if we don't have a deal, we would vote to make sure that we could operate as an equal independent country.
Well, no,
if we have a deal with the
Your
European
minister literally did stand up and say you were going to break international law.
Well, we didn't vote to break international law. What we have said is that there are various parts through this bill that we put through that if we do not get a deal, we need to make sure that we can make the arrangements suitable for a deal. But what we are looking at doing is getting a deal with the European Union that would mean that that bill would not have to be used. So it's factually incorrect to say.
No, it's not factually incorrect to say, because you are voting for something upon which international law would be broken.
If needed.
And I'm sorry, we are not a country that breaks international law. We are a country that counts all our votes. We are a bastion of democracy, and we are a bastion of upholding international law. And any legislation passed by the House of Commons or voted for by any Conservative MP that allows for the possibility of the breaking of international law is, I'm sorry, it's a form of Trumpism.
What do you think the government should be doing now? I mean, do you accept?
And I think the government could look at what is available with testing to enable some degree of better care home visiting. It was in the newspapers, I think, this morning. They're talking about 15-minute rapid tests to allow the opening of theatres and sporting venues in January. If that's possible, care home visits should be prioritised above leisure. I want to go and see a game. I can't wait to go back to the theatre, but I would far rather see my nan, who's been in a care home in Eastbourne, unable to hug anyone for 9 months. And I think the first priority for those rapid 15-minute tests should be the care sector. Whether the collaboration on decision-making should have been broader is, of course, a debate that's gone on for a long time. Should it just be the scientists around the table, or should it be business and the armed forces and almost a citizens' assembly or a government of national unity as well? These are all really good questions. And I'm sure the army has been feeding in, the armed services have been feeding in. And logistically, they are well placed to help roll out big efforts like this. Whether they could have been used further, I'm not sure. I mean, no one wants to see the army on the street enforcing rules and regulations. But in terms of logistical exercises, it's great.
There does seem to be a theme, though, Paul Holmes, particularly the Department of Health, throughout this crisis. Don't worry, we'll sort it out. Leave it to us. We don't need local authorities to help us. We don't need this. We don't need that. We don't need the army to help us. Well, maybe they do.
Well, I think Charlotte's right, and I think your question is right, that yes, and Tobias is right. I was in the chamber yesterday when he was making that speech. We should have the armed forces in the decision-making process around the table, logistically being involved. But the government has involved other bodies. My local councils, Hampshire County Council, Eastleigh Borough Council, have been working really strongly with government to make sure we get business relief rolled out, to make sure the grants are being rolled out to local businesses. So the government is working with different areas, but we can always go further. And I think it's vital you have the armed forces, who are the world leaders in logistics, being at the top of the table making the decisions too.
Well, obviously we're in the second lockdown at the moment, to the chagrin of some MPs here at Westminster, particularly some Conservative MPs who think that parts of our region that have a relatively low infection rate shouldn't be treated the same as other parts of the country.
Lockdown 2 has been very divisive across the UK, not least in my own constituency of Bracknell. Are there any circumstances in which my right honourable friend might consider early easing of restrictions?
Even in Bracknell, where for so long the rate of infection was incredibly low, and we had seen that rise in the rate of infections, and so it is important to get it under control in Bracknell as elsewhere in the country.
And presumably, Charlotte Cornell, you support that because your leader, Sir Keir Starmer, was calling for a national lockdown while the government was saying, no, we're not going to have one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Keir Starmer asked for one to coincide with the October half-term when school children could be included, and it would have been a shorter, sharper lockdown, 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, I personally feel the pain of it being an elongated one. I know we all do, and I feel sad that the decision wasn't taken earlier to allow the impact on families and business to be less, as Keir Starmer suggested.
How do you know it would have been shorter and sharper?
Well, he spoke at the time about wanting a sort of 2-week circuit breaker to
but I asked
coincide
him
with
at the time, I said, what if the numbers are still going up after 2 weeks? And he said, oh, it will be time limited. But that would have been a very awkward situation to come out of a lockdown if the numbers were still going up, wouldn't it?
Well, absolutely. But this one, of course, is also still subject to review. And we could tumble out of this one into different Tier 3, Tier 4, where there's little discernible difference between Tier 4 and a full-ish lockdown as we have here.
Are you one of those Tory MPs who is saying no more lockdowns?
I'm very sceptical, and it was one of the most difficult decisions to vote for the lockdown this time, because my constituents are suffering, and people that live in my constituency are suffering from mental health and the implications that you get from a lockdown. I don't want to see another one, and I actually think the government needs to come out of the lockdown earlier if it looks like it's having an impact, which at the moment in my patch is looking like it is, that we still have very few cases, but they were going up. But if it's looking like hospitals are under control and it's looking like cases are going down, then we should come out earlier, and I would be very sceptical to vote for any further lockdowns.
And are you one of those people like the New Forest MP Sir Desmond Swayne and lots of other people who think the data on this has been a little bit dodgy?
I think data is very confusing, and there are various bodies that produce data over this, and I've been looking at the data carefully. I do think there is a question to be answered where after we had the vote on the lockdown, it looked like actually the numbers weren't as bad as they were, and that particularly in other regions the numbers weren't going up as fast as they were. And I think the Department for Health and the National Audit Office needs to be held to account on this. I know MPs in the House are, but I do think there has to be a question about whether the data and the transparency has gone as far as it can.
How do you assess the damage in places like Dover and Kent to the economy? How quickly can we recover, if we can recover?
It's going to be huge. The damage will take years to recover from, and many businesses will go to the wall. I disagree, though, about coming out of lockdown earlier, as the speaker on the clip said. I think when you've put a rule, a regulation, a new set of restrictions in, you have to stick to them. Otherwise, there's an absolute communications nightmare. If we came out of this lockdown early, why would anyone believe anything the government later instituted at all? The communications has been absolutely dreadful. I mean, I know that yesterday Number 10 lost its director of communications, but overall it's been completely bungled. And to finish this lockdown early would further undermine anything the government tried to do in the future.
But it's about responding to a situation as the time goes on. If the cases look like they're coming down, then of course the government should act and clearly communicate to the public that it's safe to go back to a tiered system.
But of course they will come down. You don't immediately start to creep down and then release the handbrake. 3 weeks later we'll be back in the same position. You've got to scientifically look at a decent enough reduction to generate hopefully months of stability. Not weeks of stability, months.